All right, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice lunch. So now we're going to finish off what we started. We're going to finish front end. So we already finished our back end. We already finished all of our database stuff. And right now we're going to finish our front end stuff. And so recently there's this thing called a SPA. Has anybody heard of what a SPA is? It's this new trend in front end development. It stands for single page applications. And what those are, it's a single page like skeleton pretty much, and then everything is then updated dynamically with JavaScript. And so frameworks like Angular, Ember, Meteor, stuff like those all implement SPAs. Of course, in order to do that, there's lots of AJAX. Every single request is AJAX. And so there's one call that you'd have to be intimately familiar with, which is ajax.get if you're doing stuff like jQuery or fetch in our case. And so with this model, most of the logic is moved onto the client side. And so all of that will be handled with front-end JavaScript. And so in order to do a lot of that stuff, we need to use what's called DOM manipulation. And that is one of JavaScript's most powerful abilities. This gives us the power to create DOM elements. And so calls like document.createElement, well, I guess that's the only call that can do it, but document.createElement will create a virtual DOM element. And then you can actually modify other DOM elements by using calls like element.enterHTML, setAttribute, and appendChild to then add those things to your page. And so like we did in our demo a few days ago, we could do element document.createElement and pass it a string div, and that will create a div for us. We could use that and then set its inner HTML using this call to something, then append it to the body, and then we will have dynamically created some HTML on the page. And so SPAs use this a lot for every single element you'll ever see. And so this used in conjunction, remove child will remove one. This used in conjunction with fetch, we can actually create our own SPAs using vanilla JavaScript. Any questions about this stuff? So it's a little bit tedious. Like if you wanted to create an element with the class called hi, an ID called ID, and then have it say the inner HTML say hello world, and then append it to your document, you'd have to do document.createElement div, and assign that to a variable. We'll call it div. Then div.innerHTML gets hello world. Div.setAttribute, it takes two arguments. The first, the name of the attribute, so we'll say element.setAttribute class, comma, hi, and so that will set its class to hi. Then div.setAttribute ID to ID, that will set its ID to ID. And then we would have to do whatever element we want to append it to, so in this case document.body dot append child and pass it div, and that will append it to the body. And so in order to create our own SPAs, we'll have to become fetch masters. So in order to master fetch, so we have to use fetch a lot to dynamically load information, especially those that require authorization. And what's nice about fetch is it allows us to put the token in the get request header. So no longer do we have to do like localhost 3001/admin question mark token equals the token. We can then load a skeleton page and then use fetch to grab that stuff. That way we don't have the token in our URL anymore. And by doing this, this also allows us to not have to authorize the token on the front end. We can just pass via reverse proxy that request straight to the back end. Yeah.
Can you explain again why this is different from what we've been doing?
Yeah, I'll get into some specifics after I talk about the whole everything in concept. And so this allows us to dynamically add data to the page, and we can redirect the user if it becomes unauthorized. And so, can you repeat your question now? I'll answer. And so what we've been doing right now is, so we've only been using fetch thus far to submit post requests, like we're sending information. But now we're going to start to use fetch to receive information, to get information. And so before, if we wanted to visit something like if we wanted to visit the admin page, we would have to pass the token here, make sure that they're an admin, and then return all of that and render it into the admin page. But now we can just say, all right, we're going to give you the benefit of the doubt and open up this admin page, which will just be a bare bones skeleton. It won't have any information in the page. And what the page would do would say, all right, now let me make sure you're an admin and send off a fetch request to get all of the coupons or something like that. And then we would put the token in the header. That way, the token no longer goes in our URL. It doesn't get saved in our history. And that will go fetch the information. If you're indeed an admin, it will return the information, and we can use JavaScript to add that all to our page. But if you're not an admin, then our backend would reject you, and it'll say, hey, you're not an admin, and then the page could then redirect to somewhere else. So it's just a slightly different control flow, and we fixed the problem of having to do this, like $token equals the token. And so now that goes in the request header, since we can explicitly set headers within our fetch request. Does that make sense conceptually why we'd want to do this? No.
Is this bottom one, is that like in place of what was up above? Or?
Yeah. So I'll draw on the whiteboard. Are people good with this? I'll just flip it over so we can keep this picture. So say we have, man, this thing looks like it's about to fall over. Say we have our server, and this is our front-end server. So in case one, what we've been doing so far, we haven't really looked into it yet, but what we would do is we would say, all right, they want a page with all of our items. So say we're working on your dorm supplies project. They want a page with all of our items. And so what we do is we send a request over to our backend. That's like, get me the items. It returns the items. And then using that, we pass it into the pug template. And then using those items that we got, we create that page. And so most of the stuff is done within the pug template or within the rendering on the server itself. And so an alternative to that would be to, when you request this page, it just opens a bare bones page that says like loading or something like that. And then from the page, it sends a request for the items. And then when it receives the items as just pure data, as JSON, it will use our JavaScript creation, their DOM manipulation, in order to create elements for every single one of those and load that dynamically onto the page. So this disappears, and out comes the items. And so the difference is, when are we actually getting the items? Case one would be when the server is about to render the pug template, it grabs the items first and renders it into the HTML to what's finally seen. And in the second case, it just renders a blank template, and then the template itself will go fetch the items and load them dynamically. And what this solves is we no longer have to send authentication with this itself. We can send authentication within the fetch request. That way, we don't have to put our token in the header. We don't even have to have auth on our front-end server. It'll just pass that directly to our backend via the reverse proxy. Does that make sense? So this is just building upon what we've already learned. This is no longer anything that you need to be able to do when you create an application. It's just making things look nicer, making things more follow what's the current trend.
You're saying we're not going to implement it this way?
So my grand plan was to have you all implement this way, but I think what would be time better spent would be working on what we were working on last session and just making sure you're rock solid with form stuff, submitting forms, using fetch to submit forms before we move into this, because I just want to make sure that we are all comfortable with that first. So does everybody understand what this is in concept?
In the second case, what role does your reverse proxy server play then?
So the fetch is still sent to here, which then this is the same. We get items to the backend and just send raw data rather than sending a fully rendered template. Yeah.
So how do things like React and Angular fit into this?
So this is exactly what React and Angular are doing. So spas are essentially just a single page application where you load a framework or just a frame, a skeleton page like this, and then they use these fetch calls or AJAX in order to grab the raw data and then load them as components onto the page. And so what I just talked through is us manually doing what these frameworks do. Yeah.
So like that challenge that we had to refresh the page without, or refresh the pairs without, that's something like this, using a fetch call.
Yeah. So if you think back to the day when I said, all right, challenges implement cold caller and the randomization with a refresh button that refreshes, one way to do it would be to do this. The easier way to do it would just be to move all of that logic that we had on our backend onto the front end and just redo the logic. Does everybody understand this in concept? I just wanted to introduce the concept, so if you wanted to try doing stuff like Angular, you're like, okay, I see what they're doing. Do you want me to go over? Yeah.
So you mentioned that like what we'd be doing here is manually like putting through the like Angular framework. Does that make sense?
So this, if we were to do this completely, we'd be re-implementing a part of Angular pretty much.
But if you just included Angular, then it makes it like much easier to do.
Yeah, if you were to just use Angular in the first place, it would do this automatically, but I wanted you to know what's going on. Yeah.
Would it ever like be better to like just implement it yourself and or like do most people will just like use Angular?
A lot of people will just use Angular because it saves you some coding. But Angular is a pretty heavy framework. It comes with a lot of stuff. And if you're only doing just one fetch call, it might not be worth including an entire library. It might just be better to do it yourself. And so when I coded your example, I just did it myself. And so I'll go ahead and push this code after today so you can see how I went around solving that problem. Yeah?
Where does the JavaScript manipulation logic live?
In scripts.js. So if you want to see an example, so within my solution to dorm supplies, which you don't have, so I have populate pending page right here. And what this does is it assumes you've passed it a bunch of information. So where I call, so I have fetch users, which is a fetch call. It goes to admin.getUsers. It passes the token in the header, just like I was talking about, and then goes and fetches a bunch of raw data, which is the users. And then once it comes back, you'd see that res.json.then call right here. So stuff you've seen before, what does that do? It extracts the JSON from the result and passes it to that populate users page. And what does that do? Well, we iterate through all of the users, and then you see this div that gets create element div set attribute to a user, so we're calling it a user class. Then we're creating a div for the email, setting that stuff. Creating a div for the document, for the admin stuff, setting all of that stuff. Appending that to the greater div, appending that to the document and stuff, all of that. And so that'll iterate through and create a bunch of these document elements. And then at the very end, it'll append that to the page. And so this is an example of first me fetching all of the users and then dynamically creating all of the divs in order to put those users in and adding that to the page. Lots of confusion. Do people understand the concept?
This is just as opposed to coding this in a Python.
See, so the alternative to this would just be to do a for loop in Pug, and it will do the exact same thing, just on the back end of the front end rather than on the client side.
Can you show us one more time how you're, like, the advantage of this, where you're actually passing a token?
Yeah, so the advantage of this is right here. One of the advantages is that you can actually just embed the header into the fetch call. And so this fetch call is a get request to admin get users, which is a reverse proxy on our front end server. And we're giving it the token within our header. And so this no longer goes in the URL bar. It doesn't get saved in our history anywhere. And then from the response that we get, we just go ahead and create all of this stuff. And then within the admin error handler, if you are not authorized to do something, it'll just redirect you back to the home page saying, hey, you're not authorized for this information, go away. And so nowhere do they actually get any of the data. Yeah?
I guess I'm just confused why we were making fetch calls before. Why couldn't we embed the token in the header then?
So question, we were making fetch calls before. Why didn't we embed the token in the header? And so all of the fetch calls that we were making up to this point were all submitting data and submitting data to endpoints that were open. So when we first create our user, there's no authentication needed to create a user account. And so that did not need a token. But now we're actually, rather than submitting data, we're retrieving data, because fetch is just any sort of HTTP request. And so it can be a post, it can be a get, anything like that. And so for these gets, we want to include the header, the token in the header there. Did that answer the question? So the answer is because all of the fetch calls we've made thus far didn't require authorization, and these ones do. Because when we created a user, like when you're creating a user account on like your dorm supplies page, it wouldn't make sense if you needed to be an admin in order to create a user account. And so when we made that fetch, we didn't need a token. But for this stuff, when we're grabbing all of the whatever we want, so this one was turning users into admins, we needed admin privileges to get all of our users. And so that's why we had to embed the token into the header.
And because this sits like closer to the user than like our backend Pug templates, it wouldn't make sense to like make a fetch call and then try to render it in a template, right? That's like, is that like out of order? You know what I mean? I'm saying like.
So that's exactly what we were doing before. So before we didn't actually get into this, but actually we did in dorm supplies. So before, when we made a get request to the home page for the dorm supplies page, first we did a request.get. And if you remember, request.get is analogous to fetch's get, just request is on the back end and fetch is on the client side. Back end meaning anywhere on a server. So this is the back end of the front end, or the server file for the front end. And so we made a request.get to get all of the items, and that gave us our items, which we then rendered into our Pug page. So that's what's happening here. When we do res.render index and we pass items. And so that is the first method. So you have The server itself make the GET request, which then embeds the data into the Pug template. And what the user sees is just static data. It's just a rendered template. And in our alternative, all this would be you just return the index page as a bare bones page, and that index page, part of its script.js, would be to go fetch all of those items. And so first they would have an empty page, and the empty page would call fetch to grab all of the items, which would then be dynamically added to the page. Does that make sense? Is everybody following those two alternatives? They're both right. Neither is wrong. It's just the latter's a slightly better way to do it just because authentication is slightly easier. But though that way that we talked about earlier today and just having token authentication on the back end of the front end as well is totally fine. It works. Just the downside to that is you have to put the token within the URL. Is everybody following? I see some yeses. Yeah.
If you do it this way, you have to like write the JavaScript to create the divs and create the attributes and all that.
Exactly.
Would Angular do that for you? Or?
Yep. What Angular allows you to do is type as if you're doing it the first way, but it'll actually function the second way. So you type it as if like, hey, if I were to have this data, here's what the divs would look like in my HTML. And then you tell Angular, go get the data, and when you get the data, load it into this HTML. And so rather than writing the JavaScript yourself in vanilla JavaScript, you just write the HTML. You can think of it as like a Pug template, and it will actually render that on the front side, the front end, on the client side. Does this make sense in theory? Yeah.
I think we already asked this question, but so why do we have to put the token in the URL for the first method, but in the header for the second?
So ideally, we'd always put the token in the header. It's just when we make a normal GET request, there's no way to change our headers. And so when you go to the browser and say google.com, you can't really say google.com and also put this in my header. And there's no body within a GET request either. So our only way to include a token on a GET request, from the browser at least, is to put it up in the URL with that question mark token equals token. But with fetch, it allows us to explicitly set headers before we send off the request. And so that would be the preferred method just because we can put the token in the header rather than having to put it in the URL. Does that make sense to people? Yeah? Nod your head if yeah. Okay. So during hack session today, we're going to be finishing off our front-end API, or front-end server stuff. Front-end server, front-end client side, all of our front-end. And I would have liked for us to implement this, but I think our time would better be spent working on the last stuff from last time. And so working on using fetch to send data, using fetch to submit requests. Does that sound better? So I just sent an email out over lunch, shuffling up groups a little bit. So go ahead and check your emails for your new groups. I'll also put it up here. Let me just stop the recording first.